I hear the opening music fading out, so that means it's time to start. Welcome to the Pickleball Guru's brand new webinar, Pickleball Mythology 101. I'm Randy Mantiply, and I'm here with Prem Carnot, the world's premier pickleball coach and author of the best-selling book, Smart Pickleball.
Good morning, Guru Nation.
Professor Carnot, let's start off with your curriculum vitae, as everyone likes to call resumes nowadays, and how you became the pickleball guru.
Short story long, to put it the other way around. Well, I came to the United States from France in 2005, and got to play, introduced to the game of pickleball in 2006 when I bought a house in a remote island in the Pacific Northwest, and started playing there and was played recreationally. I was not very good at the beginning. Got like everyone else, trashed by players who didn't really look like pickleball players and were much older than me. But then I learned to find a groove, and the particular person who introduced me to the game ended up actually taking me to the first nationals, and then I got to see a very different level of play. And since then, I practiced a lot, and then became a much better player. And obviously, I was still getting thrashed, but I was still becoming a better player over time. And at some point during those years, I was somewhere in the southern part of California, traveling around the world, just playing pickleball. And at that point, this gentleman introduced me, asked me to help him out with some of his difficulties he was having in the game. And I ended up helping him and a bunch of his friends. And he started calling me the Pickleball Guru, and that's how the moniker came to exist. And then he insisted and asked me to teach because he thought I had some sort of capacity to do that. And so I tentatively started that about 7 years ago. And since then I have developed a program and been teaching around the world since that period of time. And that's how Pickleball Guru came to happen.
And as a pickleball guru, to further show you're qualified to teach this webinar, you're a published author.
Yes, I am. About 4 years ago, I think, we wrote a book called Smart Pickleball, and which was one of the best sellers in Amazon. And I've been teaching pickleball for over 7 years, as I said, full time, and I've been loving it.
And here's our syllabus for today. We're going to cover the 7 biggest myths in pickleball, and then we're going to dispel all those myths and give the hard reality. Plus, we have a bonus myth that recently has been, if not debunked, then certainly dispelled to a great extent. Prem, particularly in pickleball, how do these myths get so prevalent and entrenched, and why do players still adhere to them?
I think it's a combination of misinformation and misunderstanding of certain number of things, and people coming from different other sports and tend to give a certain indication, and people take that as the rule, and unfortunately most of them are myths.
And just to add to this a little bit, I think one of the reasons why they become so entrenched and also become a myth is because there's usually an always or a never attached to the beginning of it. Like you should always do this or you should never do that.
Absolutely. I agree. There's a certain should energy just being brought into the game by whoever, inculcates or informs them. And I'm a big proponent of never using that as much as possible, not using the word should, but it could be a possibility. And everything is a possibility as long as it works for you.
What you're going to get out of this webinar, like we said earlier, is the truth about all these myths and strategies. And with all this information, you'll see how to turn all of this to your advantage on the court. At the conclusion to the webinar, you'll be able to incorporate new strategies into your game to become a better player.
That sounds a very enticing one for anyone who's listening to this.
We've got 7 myths to cover, and as I like to say, because my favorite superhero said it in his first movie, let's count them down. Number 7, you need a powerful blank to be competitive. Now, this blank can be a powerful serve, a powerful return to serve, an overhead, powerful forehand, backhand, etc. It can certainly help to have a powerful shot or shots, but it's not a requirement, is it, Prem?
It is not a requirement for sure. I mean, if you do have them and if you're consistent with that, definitely you've got to make use of it. But it is not, be it all type of thing. And, if you have a serve which is effective without having to be powerful and deep, or a return of serve or any other shot, as long as you can keep the ball in play, it's the most effective way to be more playing smart pickleball. So it doesn't have to be a power serve or a power return or a power shot. But if you do have it, absolutely use it. But it doesn't have to be, is what again, there's no shoulds in it. It could be, if you have it, have it. If you don't even try it.
And specifically, you said, you mentioned power serve and power return. And in general, you don't even recommend a power serve or a power return. Why is that, Prem?
Unlike other racket sports in this game, there's not a big advantage in these serves or returns. My basic fundamental philosophy in my teaching is that do everything and anything which buys you time. So in this particular case, hitting a hard serve means that the ball is coming back faster at you, which means you have less time to organize. So I'm not a big fan of that. In general terms, younger players and faster players can probably adjust to that a little bit more quicker, but most players who are not as agile and fast, it might be a little bit more harder for them to do so. And there's no big advantage of hitting it a hard serve unless you really have a hard serve and be consistent with it. Most of the times when you try to hit hard, we might actually lose the direction of the serve or return of the serve because it might fly out. I think the middle ground would be to hit a serve which is deep and don't have to be, that hard, as long as it is consistently in. And it's easier to execute generally.
And especially on the power serve, a lot of people will serve it hard and they'll let that follow through carry them on into the court. And if they're not really making it difficult enough for your opponents, if you're already 2 or 3 feet into the court and the other team's able to hit it back about where you're standing and you have to let it bounce, you're kind of in trouble, right?
Absolutely. The other thing about it is when someone is hitting a hard serve, you're actually bringing your opponent in, because generally when someone is trying to return that serve, they don't actually have to generate any speed because the speed has already been given to you. So they basically move forward when they make contact to the ball, and they're still moving into the non-volley zone, whereas the serving team has to still wait. And then as such, when you're 3 or 4 feet into the baseline, and if the return is deep, then you have to back up again, so which is not an ideal situation you want to be in.
So here's the reality. Placement is much more important than power.
I'm a big proponent of placement over power any day. If you can do that consistently, it's much better, and it's easier on your body, and which also allows you to play this game we all love for a longer time.
And here's a couple of shots at your boot camp where you talk about how a well-placed shot with virtually no power can win a point.
Yours. Mine. Yours. Yours. Mine. Nobody home. This is what I really want you to understand, guys. You do not have to hit winners.
I'm not sure if everyone can hear it, but one boot camp participant even says what an easy shot it is when it goes right between her and her partner. And just to be clear, you're not saying never power the ball, but you are saying it's more important to place it so your opponents are in more trouble or they just can't get to it.
Absolutely. In fact, if most players out there, I'm talking about the high-end players out there. If you look at their matches, which are mostly published on the YouTube videos, you'll be surprised how many balls actually are placed in between the two players, and it's really crazy. It's really crazy to see that they don't really have to try so hard, but they're just trying to find that gap between the two players. And it's not always a power shot. Obviously, they do have the power when they need it, but most of the time, that's not what they're going for it.
And this brings us to number 6. You should always use the third shot drop. Prem, one of your principles is to use the third shot drop. Before we talk about the reality, why should you use and when should you use the third shot drop?
Well, the third shot drop is only effective when both your opponents are at the kitchen line or at the non-volley zone line. That's when the third shot drop becomes very effective. I wouldn't even call it the third shot drop at these days, and if you just call it the drop shot anytime, or the drop shot, and it could be third, it could be the fifth or the seventh. But either way, the drop shot is only effective when your opponents are at the non-volley zone line. But if they are not, there's no reason for you to bring your opponents to the non-volley zone line. I strongly believe that the team which has always dominated the non-volley zone line has always ended up winning the games. And if a team is not at that line, do not bring them in. Absolutely do not bring them in. Keep them away from that line. Keep them far away from that line as much as possible. So if your opponents have returned and stayed back or moving back, keep them back. That's my suggestion anytime, anywhere. And the drop shot is only effective when both of them are there. Why is it effective? Simply because when your opponents are at the non-volley zone line, the serving team is trying to get to the non-volley zone line, and so they're trying to drop shot. And drop shot it so that it gives them time. Again, the context here is giving themselves more time. How do they bring more time? It's because your opponents are going to wait for the ball to bounce at the non-volley zone line, and which allows you to get to the non-volley zone line in a more safer way. That it could be on the third one, if you have a very effective one to do. If you don't, you can transition into the fifth or the seventh by making your way gradually in there, but always trying to get to the non-volley zone line rather than stay back.
So here's the reality. Notice on the slide that we specify that your opponents are in position at the net. As an example, if I notice my opponent cheating towards the middle with my forehand to his backhand, I'll drive to that empty space where he should be standing. In other words, he's not standing in front of the ball. He's scooted over off more to the middle as opposed to the line. Is that a good example of where you can drive to that empty space to where he's not standing as opposed to doing a third shot drop?
It is, again, yes, it's an option which we can always look into if there is a large enough gap for them to drive into it. But if your opponents are at the line and they have given you a lot of space, then you can drive. But if they don't, I don't think that's a great option. I don't recommend it unless you're playing against players who you think are less mobile. But if they give you a gaping hole and you can drive it safely, in a sense that you have a safety of a couple of feet away from the sideline and the baseline, then that's your best option. And if there's a gaping hole, but if there isn't, I think dropping it will be the best option if your opponents are at the non-volley zone line. Having said that, as I said, there's no one size fit all type of thing. Options. and, you make your best options from where your opponents are. And in that particular context, I would always suggest, placement over power any day.
My research indicates we're at number 5. This is the old down the middle solves the riddle cliche. I think lots of these myths, we kind of talked about this before, they become myths because of the words always and never. Prem, why is always go down the middle a myth?
Always down the middle is a myth in the sense a lot of people have some confusing idea about what those myths are. Most of the times people tend to think the middle is the middle of the court. Sometimes you might have two people right in the middle and near that middle line, and it doesn't make sense to try and drive at that point or try and hit a shot in between in that line, whereas my middle is always, as we talked about in a podcast recently, we talk about middles are generally the middle of the two players. That's the middle, and that's an important that's a understanding of what the middle is. Mostly again, I don't say it is always, but mostly the middle is between the two players and not the middle of the court.
In reality, there are lots of middles in the court, and Prem already mentioned it, so here's a good chance to plug that episode that he was talking about. Go to pickleballguru.com/podcast, and you can find out all more about what the riddle really means. Because we have a really good podcast episode about that really drills down on it. So we're talking about going down the middle. And even if you are always going down one of the middles of the court, including between the two opponents, that may not be your best option. Can you give an example where you shouldn't go down the middle or a middle of the court frame?
You shouldn't go down the middle. Well, when you have both your opponents at the middle, or who are covering the zones very well, in that particular case, then driving down the middle might not be an option. And then I don't think that's always the best option at that point. The idea is to try and get your players to split so that you get the middle. So that's probably one of the options I'm looking at. Is there any one you looking at, Randy?
Again, there are some times when your opponents are kind of, both of them or one of them maybe cheating way towards the middle. In other words, they're bunched up 3 or 4 feet away from each other, and they're giving you way loads of room on the sideline. And that may be the easiest shot that you have, is to just send it down between the line and that person, as opposed to the two players. They have to be really out of position for that, though.
Absolutely. They're going to have to be really out of position, and that's why it doesn't mean that I would not hit down the line if I had to.
Right.
Or I would not recommend people hitting it down the line, but that would not be my first option of trying to split an opponent. Unless they're really cheating, then I would go for it. But otherwise, I'll keep trying to get the middle between them.
Right. Depends on how safe the shot actually is.
Absolutely. It's just a much more smaller court than most other racket sports, especially tennis, where there's a lot more space for that type of shot, which is especially coming from a tennis background. I can tell you it's quite joyful to hit down the liners easily on a tennis court, and it sometimes works well in pickleball courts, but for that to happen, you've got to have a lot of space between the two players.
Right. So, number 4. This is, since you were speaking of tennis, this is for a lot of the tennis players or tennis players transitioning to pickleball out there. I have enough power, placement, and mobility so I can win from the baseline. It's rare that you see players win with a baseline game, isn't it, Prem?
Absolutely. It's not been my experience to see any player winning from the baseline in pickleball. So I'm not a big fan of baseline pickleball. And I've never encountered yet. Maybe there is some data out there which shows someone winning from the baseline, but it's rarely the case in competitive pickleball or smart pickleball. I don't never see anyone play and win from the baseline. Almost every player who understands the game well and reads the game well, they know the game is won and lost at the non-volley zone line and not at the baseline. It's another myth which comes from other racket sport background, and I don't particularly think that it's the most best strategy in at least in doubles. In singles, definitely, it's a much more effective in singles to do that. But even there, you can win a few number of points from the baseline. But ultimately, coming in and finding the gap is the best option.
So, as Prem said, the game is won and lost at the net. Here's what else I'll add. You generally don't win the point backing up from the net either. After we've lost a point, sometimes I'll ask my partner to look at where he or she is standing. Why does backing up get you into so much trouble, Prem?
Here is a recommendation I would say to my listeners here today, is take a few steps away from the non-volley zone line, and from that particular area, tell me how much of the court on the opposite side of the net you see past the net. And you'd be surprised, further away you are from the net, less of the court you see if your opponent's court you see, which means that there's only area you can actually hit. Closer to the non-volley zone line you are, more space you see, more feet you can see of your opponent, and more away you are, less you see of it. And that's one of the reasons why backing up is not a best option in pickleball, because as you back up, you give more space. I quote one of my friends and fellow coach and a good professional player, Dave Weinbach, who says this one quite often: good things happen when you move forward, and he would say something like, bad things happen when you move backwards. So, and I truly believe that statement is pretty accurate. Stay in front, in attack in front for most of the cases. For most, again, it's not. I never said you should or be a definitive in any cases, but in most cases, that is the best option. Being in front is always going to be the best option.
And the other thing I found is when you back up, your whole body balance changes. And what I mean by that is you're typically going to do one of two things. You're either going to hit it with the same power that you normally would if you weren't backing up, which means you're going to probably put it into the net, or you're going to overcompensate because you're backing up, and then you're just going to shoot it up into the air for probably an easy overhead smash for the other team. Is that fairly typical?
Absolutely. And, this actually answers to a bunch of questions when some number of, players who have asked me this question over time is, why do I keep popping the ball up? The reason behind when you pop your ball up is because your weight is behind you. Be it a right-hander player or a left-handed player, if your right foot or your left foot is on the backside and you're hitting from that area up, there's only way it goes is an upward motion, which actually puts the ball in an arc, which is only upward motion, which forces your opponent to hit downwards towards you. Whereas if you move forward, if you're a right-handed player with your left foot or your right foot for a lefty, the balance, the weight is in front of you, which means that you have more control over the ball, and you're actually moving the ball from a low to high position, but in a more controlled manner, which allows you to keep the ball in play in a lower trajectory or in a more unattackable trajectory than when the weight is behind you. So that is one of the reasons why you keep lobbing balls up, because your weight is behind you. When you back up, your weight goes behind, and then you start popping the ball up. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much. We are now up to number 3, never lob. To first start off with this, Prem, you're not a huge fan of the lob, are you?
Very true. I'm not a big fan of lob. I don't like those pesky lobs over my head. To be honest, but I do see the validity of lobs in certain areas, but never lob is not what a statement I would make.
And so certainly the reality is this is a never say never deal, because the lob can be surprisingly effective if done correctly, as you can see from this one clip.
Jack Laramie, Michael Funk, Ed White, Marty Smith, please report to referee Andy Jones for your match on court number 1, Southern Tropic Courts.
And I know you're not a big fan of the defensive lob, Prem. I see certain players use it anyway in rec play, and even when it works, I notice they often don't move up to the line. What I'll add here is if you want the lob to be truly effective, especially a defensive lob, you've got to get up to the line to finish the point.
Absolutely, Randy. I mean, before we even go to the defensive, offensive lob, let me actually be more clear on what a defensive and an offensive lob is. An offensive lob is one I consider is when you are at the non-volley zone line, you're dinking with your opponent, and at some point when your opponent is actually slouched or crouched to anticipate the next dink because you've got them in a rhythm, and you lob right over their head. It's one of the best lobs which I would suggest, because at that point their body weight is already in front, and they can't really do anything about that ball which is over their head, and that's a very effective lob, and that's the one I call the offensive lob. So that's generally a very good lob and a more effective one, and can be used strategically. It's a good one, and no matter what level you play. A defensive lob, in most cases, is people who stay in the baseline and just lob and hope to get past the opponents and see if they can win points that way. Like you mentioned, when they do sort of these defensive lobs, if they don't jump to the line, it just doesn't work very well. And it works to a certain level in the recreational play, and certain levels when people are not very mobile. That type of lob works from the baseline. The only time the defensive lob is something which I would recommend or suggest is when someone actually does you an offensive lob and you are actually going back to try and get to that ball, and if you have no other option at that point, you are just scrambling to get to the ball, and you have no other option, and then you're trying to hit a defensive lob. That's because that's all you have. If you had all the time in the world, you might want to try and hit a drop shot and try and get back to the non-volley zone line. But if you're just scrambling, there's no other thing you can do but probably just lob back, just to keep the ball in play and then try to get in.
Right, you're not in any
so that's
position.
the only time a good defensive lob is an effective one. By just standing there and hitting lobs after lob from the baseline is not the best strategy as far as I'm concerned. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was just going to clarify that what you're talking about is you're not quick enough on this particular play to get in front of the ball or to get the ball in front of you, so that way you can maybe drop it into the kitchen. You're kind of off balance anyway, so you may as well whack it up as high as you possibly can and hope you get some distance on it, so that way it becomes an effective lob on the other side.
That's right. And that is after someone has given you an offensive lob. Someone who has lobbed over you, and then you or your partner who is trying to get to the ball and try to, they don't have the time, and then basically that's, what the best option would be to just throw the ball up there in the air and try and recover a little bit. So that's the only time a defensive lob I wouldn't say effective. At least that's one I would recommend using it when you don't really have anything else. But just standing there and throwing lobs from the baseline is not always the greatest strategy. But again, obviously, if you have an opponent out there and if you see them with knee braces and they're hobbling around and if you want to lob over them, be my guest.
We are up to myth number 2. There's 2 sides to the court, Prem. I cover my side, my partner covers his. I get all the balls in my 220 square feet. My partner gets the balls in his 220 square feet of space. Why is this a myth, Prem?
You'd be actually very surprised when you actually start playing pickleball when you are actually covering just those 2 zones, as you call the 2 boxes or 2 sides of the middle line. How much gap actually is in between you and your partner, and in fact, this is when the ideal play comes in play when balls can be whizzed past you in between, and this is oftentimes which happens to players when they don't cover the zones. In fact, ideal situation, and I think we have a podcast around that one too, is to be on the 2/3 zones and leave 1/3 open. It's not 2 halves you're covering, but 2/3. So it's actually, the court is divided in 3 sections and not into 2 halves as the myth goes by. And so there's you'd be very surprised when you do it as 2 halves how much gap actually there is between you and your partner.
So the reality is players have to move in tandem and should be 6 to 7 feet from each other. And this may mean that you're not even on your side of the court. If your partner gets pulled really wide on let's say a cross-court dink, you should probably be somewhere in the middle of the court, like straddling the center line, or even almost entirely in your partner's court.
Absolutely. Again, that's not your partner's court. It's your team's court. You work together as a team, so the whole court is yours. But you're covering the best zones, the best possible attacking zones of your opponents, and giving your opponent the less possible areas to hit to, and make them hit the impossible shot. So that's the important part of covering the better zones of the court and leaving the zones which are difficult for your opponents to execute. So in this particular scenario which you talked about, even if your partner is being pulled away, you're moving to cover the zones, the hittable zones from where your opponents are going to hit, and giving them the impossible shot to hit.
And one of my catchphrases is, that arm ain't getting any longer. And just to emphasize reality number 2, if that arm ain't getting any longer, a player only has one choice. And what's that, Prem?
Well, the choice for me in that particular case is to be able to know what the zones are and then cover those zones. Comparatively, you and your partner cover the most important zones and leave the other zones open.
And if that arm's not getting any longer, you have to move your feet towards the ball. And when you move your feet towards it, your partner has to move right along with you to stay within that 6 to 7 feet.
Thanks for the reminder, Andy. I like that. I like that wonderful analogy. So you say that the feet will grow longer than the hands. Is that what you were telling me?
They can move the body much more than the hands can, at least.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so now we're at myth number 1. And this is probably the biggest myth in all pickleball. The forehand always takes the middle. You spoke a bit about this on the aforementioned podcast episode when we talk about the middle. So what's the validity behind this myth, Prem? Why should the forehand typically take the middle?
There's some real validity on generally about the forehand in the middle takes the shot, and there's a good reason for it. Generally because the person who has a forehand generally has more power in their shots than they do on their backhand. That's one one validity statement around that one. And the other one is also when you are generally on a forehand, your arm is stretched away from your trunk of the body, which means that you have a lot more reach to a ball, which makes it easier. Whereas when you're going on a backhand, you're actually going across your trunk, which basically means that the distance you're going to cover is less. And there's also, an understanding that most players out there who play this game tend to be weaker on their backhand than on their forehand. So a person with a stronger forehand can take more balls. So there's a valid statement in that intention. And in fact, in the higher level players, the dominant player or the alpha player in the subset of that group who they're playing together will probably be the person who try and take more balls to sort of save or help the partner whose backhand might be a little bit more weaker than the forehand. So that's not always the case, but it's an understanding in which validates that statement which you said about forehand the forehand in the middle takes always a shot. I'm not a big proponent of that always. In fact, the best options at that point for me is when two players know exactly what their zones are, and if they are covering their 2/3 every time and being in those attacking zones where they always cover, they move as a wall on the court, and so whoever is in the middle zone or in the middle third will take the ball, irrelevant of whose forehand it is, whose backhand it is. And if they start knowing how to do that well consistently, and there would be no more confusion, and then each one knows their roles on the court. That's my suggestion as far as that myth goes. But having said that, I do understand why that biggest myth is always the forehand has to take the ball. And it can be valid, especially in certain areas where a forehand can do that, is when you're at the baseline, when the return of serve comes to you at the baseline, then the person with the forehand can probably cheat a little bit more. And the reason behind it is, again, you can always recover because there's a little bit more time because you're hitting it from the baseline to readjust. But once you're at the non-volley zone line, at the attacking zones, I think the 2/3, 1/3 rule will be the most effective one, and when everyone knows where the middle third, who wants to take the ball in the middle third, then I don't think the forehand has to be the only answer at that point. And I also want to reiterate on this particular statement that some of the times players look at the professional players and on YouTube and say, hey, well, they do that all the time. And I totally understand where that's coming from, that statement. It's totally easy to do that in that particular setup because that's a strategy which has been worked around earlier between the two players to be able to let the person with the dominant forehand to take the ball so that they can help their partner. So that's a strategy which has already been worked together. But they're both completely, are very consistent enough that they can always readjust, and someone who wants to be in the middle third and takes that ball can do that too. So, but then again, we are all not as good as those guys are, and for most of us, and so the option at that point would be not always do that combination of forehand in the middle takes the shot, but mostly the person in the middle third takes the shot. Does that make sense? It's a long one.
Nope, that's fine.
I got the essence of it.
And I'm going to give you another example in a minute. So just to be clear, here's the reality. The person with the best shot takes the middle, whether it's a backhand or the forehand. One of the things that I appreciate when my partners do, and for better or for worse, I do this, but I'll use the example of my partner being up at the line. When I'm receiving in the ad court or the left side, I'm pretty good about getting up to the line. but I have no problem at all with my partner poaching or taking it with his backhand. Even though I'm closer at the line, I still may not be fully set. In other words, my body may either still be pulling forward or it may be, stopping before I can fully get set, in which case I may not have a good shot. While my partner's, if it's a drop shot, he's able to come in and take it better, or he can poach it, which is an even better situation. Is this another example where the backhand should or can take the middle successfully?
Absolutely. In fact, I'll go on record to say that there's a national finals match a few years ago. I think I remember very clearly. It was, I think, between two players from the Pacific Northwest, Enrique Ruiz and Wesley Gabrielson, who ended up winning that year. Were playing against two players. I think it was Chris Miller and Matt Staub. And I think if you can pull that video and put out there the clip, you will see a sequence of shots where the dominant player in that particular setup, Chris Miller, was actually on the left-hand side of the court, and there's a lot of balls which were hit in that middle zones, which were taken by Matt Staub with his backhand. So they were covering the zone. So it's important to really know that, and it gives you a good idea of how to navigate that, especially once you start honing that way, then you get a better backhand anyhow to play that way.
Excellent, thank you. And there you have it. Before we get to the bonus myth, here's a quick recap. First myth, you need to power all your shots. The reality is placement is much more important. Always drop the third shot. The reality is only drop the third shot when it's to your advantage. Don't be doing a drop shot when your opponents are hanging back at the baseline. The next myth is always go down the middle. The reality is there's more than one middle, and it may not be your best shot. My power means I can play at the baseline, and the reality is the game is won and lost at the net. Get to and hold the line. Don't back up. Prem's dreaded lob, you should never do it, but in reality the lob has other advantages. I've got my side of the court, you've got yours. The reality is you need to move with your partner. You should be covering 2/3 of the court, not the full 100%. And the final myth, forehand always takes the middle, but the reality is whoever has the best shot should take it. And do you have anything else to add on any of these, Prem?
When I just want to make sure when I say 2/3, it's you and your partner together covering 2/3, and not just you covering 100%, or
or your partner covering 2/3
2/3
and you covering 1/3.
Yes.
Yes, each you and your partner are covering 1/3 of the court.
That's 2/3 of the court,
right,
and leaving 1/3 open.
Right.
That's the option, which is suggested.
And not sure if it needs to, but you're covering the right 2/3 of the court. Or I should say the correct 2/3 of the court.
I got confused when you said right 2/3.
Yeah, that's why I corrected it. So, as promised, here's our bonus myth. To be an expert or great at something, you need to practice it or do it for 10,000 hours. The concept of the 10,000-hour rule was started with Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers. He used examples like the Beatles, who played lots and lots and lots of sets in, I believe, Hamburg, Germany, and Bill Gates, who did lots and lots of computer programming before he founded Microsoft. Plus, it's an easy round number to remember. And there's no guarantee that doing something for 10,000 hours will make you great, but there is some validity to the 10,000-hour rule. I think when we talked about this before, Prem, you mentioned muscle memory's a good example of what the 10,000-hour rule does for you.
Absolutely. And the one of the easiest ones I can think of is driving a car. When you start driving a car, you start, you're nervous, and you have all sorts of butterflies in your stomach, and you're afraid that you might run into a ditch or or hit a tree. You get all these fear, and when you're about to merge, you're scared about all these big semi trucks which are passing by. But over time, you just practice and practice. You just keep driving until, it just becomes part of your system that you don't even think about it twice anymore. You know what to do. You know when to merge and when to put your, turn light signal and turn whenever you need to and change lanes whenever you have to. That's part of the experience you get, and then it just becomes part of your muscle memory. And obviously, before you started driving, there was probably a mentor, your parents, your siblings, your uncle, your grandfather or grandmother, who was out there helping you out, give you some ideas on how to understand what driving a car means and the safety rules. And sometimes you might have an instructor, a car driving instructor from a school, a driving school. So either way, there's that which is initially being given to you, and later on you start working on, making the game, the driving more fun and easy for you. So it's the same way with anything else, you practice. It's not only pertaining to pickleball, or it's in any given domain, just over time, you just get better at it.
And that's probably one of the reasons why he uses such different examples. The Beatles and Bill Gates probably don't have a lot in common, but they each excelled in their respective fields. Here's the but part to Gladwell's argument. There's no guarantee that doing something for 10,000 hours will make you great. And Gladwell doesn't really differentiate between types of practice, and that's really what's important. As I mentioned, 10,000, it's a nice round number, and there's really no study for whether 8,000 hours or 12,000 hours is good or better or enough than the 10,000 hours. And there's recently been a few studies with classical violinists who are fairly young and certainly great or experts, but they haven't had time to practice for 10,000 hours. In other words, they're already great without putting in all that time. And some of that, Prem, could be because they had really, really good teachers. So here's the best counter to the 10,000 hour myth. It's doing activities recommended by experts to develop specific abilities, identifying weaknesses and working to correct them, and intentionally pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. And this comes from 6seconds.org. Now, Prem, I know you don't like to talk yourself up, Prem, but I don't think it's in dispute that you're a pickleball expert and that you have 10,000 hours of pickleball under your belt.
I'm sure I do have that. I don't really know. I probably do. I definitely love, and I'm a, first and foremost, a pickleball enthusiast. I enjoy the game. I love this game. I've known this game for a number of years, and I continue to enjoy it and share whatever information I've garnered. I'm an eternal student of the game, so I keep learning every day and every moment. Anytime I'm on the court, I always get a lot of insights from other players, and sometimes when I'm even not playing and I'm probably just driving from one destination to the other, and I would be something which would pass through me on a ride would make something, an analogy which would be helpful for, being able to give that information to the pickleball friends of mine in a way which would make sense to them. So I'm constantly trying to upgrade the information and the knowledge I garnered through the pickleball community. So first and foremost, I'm a lot of gratitude to all my pickleball friends and for teaching me so that I can be a better teacher.
And when we talk about a better teacher, a couple of points here at your boot camp. You really focus on the player not just overall strategies. In other words, you're not going to pull out, the slides from this webinar and talk about 7 myths. And we'll talk about this more in a bit, but you really, and I mean really, hone in on what an individual player is doing right, and especially what he or she is doing wrong, especially those old habits that players fall back on.
Absolutely. I'm really, in boot camps, I'm really focused on in each and every student. I watch it's an overall package of understanding and how they play the game. And it's it could be the biomechanics, it could be the strategies, it could be the physical form and the capacity, everything. I really try and get every information I can possibly to make each and individual player in those boot camps a very individualized session, but also individualized experience inside a group, and so it could be totally different from two people who are in the same boot camp, where information would be very, very different. I mean, the strategies might be the same, but the approach might be very different from each player, because depending on their capacity, physical capacity, and also skills capacity, and so that I can adjust accordingly so that they can bring the best out of them. Does that make sense?
Yes. And on the last point, when we discussed moving from beginner/intermediate to advanced, we don't have any hard data on this, but if you had to estimate after boot camp, a 3.0, for example, would move to a 3.5 or a 4.0, a 3.5 to a 4.0 or 4.5. In other words, your rating would probably move up at least by 0.5, maybe a full point.
Absolutely. That's been my experience, and systematically for most of the players who have got feedback from the boot camps. That has been their experience for them personally, and some of them come back to tune up so that they can move to the next level. So we do see a few number of people who have been on these boot camps coming back to move their game to the next notch. So we continue honing their skills to be a better player. It's not about winning and losing. It's about them being able to play the best possible smart pickleball where they enjoy playing it. And my commitment is to make sure that they're fully enjoying playing the game we all love in a way which is satisfying to them 100%. That's my commitment is to make sure that they enjoy playing the game and not get frustrated with it.
And when we talk about moving up to these levels, it's because you started at the beginning or at the bottom just like everybody else, right? Is it fair to say that you took the slow route in order to get to where you are today?
I probably did.
Yeah.
Yes. I did have a few number of well-meaning friends and coaches out there who helped me along the way, but I definitely did take the slow route. I didn't really have an expert to guide me through. I did definitely get some basics in place, and then there were some number of players who introduced me to different other strategies of the game, but I definitely had to do it by myself.
One of the things that you've always said was, after coming to boot camp, it doesn't take a lot to quickly become better than probably 80% of the players out there. Can you expand on that a little bit?
By the time people come to these boot camps, I think the experience they get is so individualized, so fine-tuned to their own proper game. They have a much better understanding of the game for themselves. And that gives them not only the confidence to execute what they want to do, because it's been so repeated so many times during the boot camp, that generally when they come out, they are actually much more better players for themselves, and they execute, the strokes in a much more consistent manner. When you look at any number of games, I'm not even talking about matches, but I'm talking about any number of games when you play against each other. The frustrating part is that you are not being able to be consistent enough to keep the ball in play and hit strokes which allow you to be consistent. In post boot camp, generally people tend to not only have the understanding and the mechanics and support structure for that, but then they generally tend to get very consistent with most number of strokes they play.
So at the Guru's Boot Camp, it's a small group and it's a very intensive training. It takes place at several locations throughout the states and throughout the world. It used to be 3, now it's 4 days. It used to be 6, now it's 7 sessions. It's limited to 8 participants. As you've been mentioning before, it's very individualized. And Prem, you mentioned that it's designed primarily for 3-0, 3-5, and 4-0 players.
Absolutely. It's mostly designed for them. Higher groups can come, but I think they would enjoy unless it is it's a solid group of 4 players of the same skill level, where I can individualize it to a very specific session. For most players, I think it's geared to 3-0, 3-5, and 4.0 players.
And in addition to boot camps, you also have clinics. Can you quickly discuss the difference between a boot camp and a clinic?
Absolutely. In clinics, you will get a little bit of my attention, which means you still will get some part of me outside me explaining all the strategies and demonstrating it and having you do it. You'll also get maybe a few minutes of my time in a clinic, in a 5-hour session, whereas a boot camp is multiple hours, and I think it's 15 hours, and it's very, very individualized. I'll be on your back, repeating it millions of times, and till that actually makes sense to you. And I'll find different ways till that actually makes sense to you in the way it can be effective to your game.
And for the boot camp itself, we mentioned this before, there's 7 on-court training sessions. And Prem's going to talk about each of these sessions so y'all will have an understanding on why they're important in your development. But it's worth mentioning that the 7th session, live coaching, is brand new this year. Prem just started it at the Richmond Boot Camp. You carried it on to the Vail Boot Camp, and it's going to be at the Sacramento and Tucson Boot Camp, as well as all of the 2019 boot camps. The first session, evaluation assessment, is what I liken to entering Prem's pickleball funnel. Everyone goes in at the same time, and as you start passing through the later sessions, your boot camp instruction and experience just gets more and more individualized. Prem, can you speak a bit more as to what goes on in this first session?
Absolutely. In the first session, since it's a group which I get to discover in person for the first time, the first session of 2 hours consists of people playing together in different matchups and setups, so that I actually get a good idea on how the individuals play inside the group and how the skill levels match each other, so that I could place the 2 groups, the 4 people players, in a group which are more of a similar skill set, or at least who have a little bit more similar game plans together, so that it's not where someone who's a little bit more executes the ball a little bit more better than the other group, and they don't get matched into the same place, where then it gets frustrating for the player who's actually playing, who was able to hit a few number of consistent strokes, cannot be able to move the next level. So I try to assess that during the first session.
And this brings us to the second session, which is drop shot till you drop. This is all about the drop shot. And Prem, you think the drop shot is pretty important, don't you?
I do. It's the most important part of the game. I call it the critical drop shot, and it's a shot which brings the serving team into the non-volley zone line. And so we talk all about the drop shots, the myth, but also execution of that drop shot from anywhere on the court. So there's a lot of drill and a lot of practice which goes through on this particular session, where you are asked to drop from different locations and different places and make sure you get to that non-volley zone safely. So there's a lot of that fun experience about drop shots, and it's one of the questions which often when boot camp participants fill out their what they want to master and do, and that's one of the constant questions I get, is to really get a mastery over the drop shot. So by the time the session is over, I'm sure on the very first day most of the players are ready to go back and get a good night's sleep, because I work them as hard as I can to make sure that they get that drop shot till they drop, as the title says.
So the first session on day 2 is kitchen play. Now, this is the session that you're either a tiger or a shark, and then maybe even back again. What goes on with kitchen play, Prem?
I call this session being a shark at the net. It's basically all the strategies involved around net play, which means the dinks, the volleys, the putaways, and all the strategies around, and how you actually execute all these shots in a more consistent manner. So the whole drill training session on this particular session is all about net play, how to dink and how to dink and how to attack, and when to attack, especially.
And the afternoon session for that day is all about developing consistency. And this is what the great players have. They have lots and lots of consistency, don't they, Prem?
Absolutely. And not to go long on this one, any good player, you ask them how they became good. Unless there are a few number of players who have innate skills, but most players out there tend to have worked really, really a lot of hours of practice. And so building consistency means that building muscle memory in every stroke. So this particular session consists of mostly trying to build your consistent strokes, so that, and especially in this particular case, one of the ones we use is the ball machine, where the ball is coming really, really hard at you, because that's another one of those questions I get asked oftentimes from players, that we deal with a lot of bangers in our communities, and they just keep hitting balls so hard at us, and we don't know what to do. We keep ducking and weaving away from it, and they don't know how to protect themselves, or don't know how to actually deal with hard hitting balls. And in this particular case, we use the ball machine to have balls really coming hard at them. It's funny, every time the first time you see the players coming out there and trying to practice this one, they have jittery legs, and they're afraid, and they're afraid that they will get bruised and hit, and they do get hit a few times at the beginning, but by the time the session is over, they're so consistent, they want more.
And I know there's a smile on Prem's face right now, because we're going to talk about the session, which I believe is Sunday in the morning, where Prem puts on his white suit and disco shoes for his favorite part of boot camp.
Absolutely, and this is one of the best sessions, and in fact, I get a lot of wonderful feedback, because this is a culmination of basically all the things we put in place during the first 2 days. By the time the third day comes, we're really talking about placement and positioning, and it's all about consistently knowing how to move your partners around and or your opponents around, and when to find the opening, and then what to do with the opening. So there's three sections in that particular one, which is called dancing with your partners, an amazing one, and almost every participant have always like had the aha moment by the time the session is, ended, and want to continue dancing with your partners by the time the session is in place.
Afternoon session on Sunday is very, very individualized. And this is taking it home. This is where everyone gets their one-on-one time with you, Prem.
Absolutely. It doesn't mean that they don't get any one-on-one time during the first few days, but this is the one session where actually I basically, jot down everything which I've been noticing about a game and giving them really honest feedback about here's what's happening and here's what needs to happen, and giving them not only the mechanics and the understanding of the game, and then we sort of, work on a certain number of those things which I really want them to keep working, and give them some strategies on how to work around that one when they go back home, so that they continue, honing skills on that particular drill or anything, so that they get more consistent with that particular shot, because I normally track them after the session. So that's one of the sessions where, and also a session which allows players to check in with me and tell me what they still want help with, and so we can work on that. It's it differs from each player. It goes from 25 minutes to 30 minutes, or half an hour to 45 minutes, where they get a lot of my personal attention, and I give them a very specific homework, so to speak, which they take home to work on as they make progress in their next level of game.
And the new session that happens Monday morning is a great addition to boot camp. And I'm guilty of this. You drill, you practice, and when you get into a game situation, there's that inconvenient open window where it all flies out of. This session actually gives the participants the opportunity to apply all that information from the previous 3 days before you get back home.
Absolutely. This is a wonderful addition, and I have to thank my participant who suggested me to continue working on this particular part of the boot camp. And this is a 3-hour session on a Monday morning, generally after the 3-day boot camp. And this 3-day session is pretty much your playtime, and I am there doing not play-by-play commentary, but I'll be there having you play and, really questioning you why you do this and why should you do this and why are you doing it, why is it should and why can't it be could, and giving them other options. And, but it's a lot of play, the 3 hours, but at the same time I will stop, and every time when the particular strategy or particular understanding of the game is not completely taken into account, and so give them a little bit of live feedback on how they play and what needs to be done. So those are a few number of options we talk about during the session, and it's one of the sessions which is becoming now very prominent since we started 2 boot camps ago.
And your game will improve. And Prem mentioned this before, but he wants your game to improve so much that you follow up with your students 2 to 4 weeks after boot camp to make sure that it's coming along, and if they have any questions or need any additional advice.
Absolutely. I'm totally 100% committed to seeing every individual who comes through these boot camps improve and play the best possible they can. And I'm committed 100% to seeing them, and so I will track and follow as much as they want me to track and follow them and find out where they are in their journey, and if there's anything I could do to help and suggest and give them strategies or on the phone, or even if they want to FaceTime and find put a play where they're playing and ask me any suggestions. I'm open to any type of platform because I'm committed and dedicated to making sure that they continue to improve the game, even if they're no more in the boot camp. So my first normal tracking time, as you said, it will start up for about 4 weeks after the boot camp, and then it will go for a few, as long as the students want me track them.
What's included at boot camp, just to reiterate a bit, it's 4+ hours of on-court training on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and there's 3+ hours on Monday for 15+ total hours. There's 7 on-court training sessions, additional court time for play and drills for the true pickleball fanatics out there. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday will provide lunch for 3 days. In addition to that, for the 4 days, we'll provide water, sports drinks, and light snacks every day. Other meals and accommodations are not included. There's a Friday night get-together. That's not included either. You pay your own way on that, but it's always a fun time to come and have dinner with the guru and everyone else in the class. Why should you choose the Guru's Boot Camp? Prem's an IPTPA certified coach. He's been a 3-time featured coach at USAPA Nationals. Like we've talked about, he's probably got way more than that 10,000 hours of pickleball on the court. The guests are limited to provide individual instruction. There will never be any more than 8 participants at a boot camp. Pro players still consult with Prem to improve their game or correct their mechanics. Prem mentioned before he's got a few repeat customers that have come to boot camp more than once. And finally, this is Prem's career. Prem, pickleball is not a side hustle for you, is it?
Absolutely not. It's been 7 years, and I'm fully committed to making this a success for every individual student who come through these boot camps. So I'm totally committed to that. So it's not a job for me. It's a passion. It happens to be something which sustains me and my family. But most importantly, it's something which I do passionately and committed to 100%.
And I'm the guy that pulls together all of the data from post-boot camp reviews, and Prem's coaching is always a 5 out of 5. It's kind of funny when we ask the least favorite part of boot camp, and the typical answer is nothing. Prem, you've been getting some comments that the other least favorite part is that it's over with. Is that correct?
Absolutely. They wanted to go on for a while. I wish I can, but I do have to get back to my family, so I do get that.
We mentioned earlier that Prem gets boot camp repeat customers because they love it so much, and many wanted 5 days instead of 3. We did split the difference, and we did give 4 days of coaching at this point. And Prem, Charlotte is your favorite success story at boot camp. Why is that?
Charlotte was also in my very, very first boot camp, and a number of years ago. And Charlotte came through, and she was really struggling with her game, and she really had a lot of mechanical issues in her game, but also a lot of them also in the mental blocks around her game. We jointly worked together in trying to get some of those cobwebs out of her thought process as well as her mechanics, and she became a much better player by the time the boot camp was over, and then she went back to her local clubs where she used to be playing, and lo and behold, she called me later on to tell me how she was the player who used to be avoided by most players, especially the higher group players in her local group. And now they were all inviting her not only to play, and now she had the option of choosing who she wanted to play with from a place where she was disregarded to being now the player they wanted to play with. It was a big transformation for her just right after the boot camp. That is by itself the big success story, and I always find a warm, fuzzy place in me when I know that she succeeded in doing what she wanted to do. I contributed to it, but she's the one who did the work.
So just a quick recap. There's only 8 guests, 4 days, 15+ hours of individualized instruction, 7 distinct sessions designed to improve your entire game, individual assessment to continue your improvement, and there's some more. For the boot camp itself, you also get access to the Drop Shot Masterclass. You get a half hour of Skype coaching if you desire. You get copies of Prem's Smart Pickleball book, either both the ebook and the autographed softcover. You get a Guru signature paddle, and you get a Smart Pickleball t-shirt. There's a few other things that we hand out at boot camp, but the entire package is typically valued at $29.78. But if you register today, boot camp is $14.97. That's 50% off the entire value and $500 off what we typically offer. So if you're ready to improve your game, perfect your good strokes, and correct the bad ones, and see just how great you can be, here's where Prem will be holding his boot camps. In Sacramento in October, we're sold out. We have 8 participants already filled up. Because Prem will be in the area, we'll actually add a second boot camp if there's interest, and that will be held on Monday, October the 15th through Thursday, October the 18th. I'm going to give you my contact information later on, so if you're interested in attending this additional Sacramento boot camp, don't hesitate to give me a call or send me an email. For Tucson, there's only 1 spot remaining. For Vero Beach, there's plenty of spots remaining. For Vero Beach 2, this says 4, but there's actually only 2 spots remaining at this point. Costa Rica, we're sold out. There's 5 spots remaining in Richmond, and there's plenty of spots left for Kansas City and France in July. And we'll also be adding Vail, Colorado in August and Kona, Hawaii for October. And just to make things a bit easier, on the website there's a coupon code for the $500 off, or you can give me a call and I'll get you registered. Prem, how excited are you about these upcoming boot camps, especially the Sacramento one?
I'm very, very excited about every boot camp. It doesn't only mean Sacramento. Every one of them are, very unique and special experiences for me as well as for the participants. So I'm excited about all this being on a pickleball court and being able to impart information to my students. So I enjoy it, and I hope continued enjoyment also from the participants of these boot camps.
So if you're ready to register for an amazing pickleball experience that will definitely improve your game, here's where to go to register. www.pballbootcamp.com or www.pickleballguru.com/bootcamp. They will take you to the exact same site. Be sure to use the coupon code at the website for your choice of the bootcamp breakthrough experience that you desire. And if you have any questions whatsoever, here's our contact information. If you have questions about boot camp, you can contact Prem at 773-615-0478 or Prem at thepickleballguru.com. Anything else, boot camp or anything else pickleball related, you can contact me at 703-459-0001 or Randy at thepickleballguru.com. These are our cells or mobiles, if you like the European term, so you can call or text us in addition to email. At the Pickleball Bootcamp registration page, if you scroll down, you'll find a link where you can schedule a call for Prem if you like. And just as a reminder, if you're interested in Sacramento, give me a buzz or shoot me an email so we can verify interest in setting up an extra boot camp the week before. And again, that registration website is pballbootcamp.com or pickleballguru.com/bootcamp. Any questions at all about registration or pickleball, don't hesitate to contact me by call, text, or email. I'm at 703-459-0001. My email address is randy at thepickleballguru.com. Professor Carnot, that concludes our webinar, Pickleball Mythology 101. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Nothing else. Just keep enjoying pickleball. And remember, it's only pickleball.
It's only pickleball. Thank you so much, Prem. Take care.